In 2008, Samsung's smartphone manufacturing facilities were scattered throughout mainland China. Just 15 years later, those factories have disappeared, and nearly all of them have relocated to Southeast Asia.
It may have given Samsung a competitive advantage to go to Vietnam first.
But Apple was on its heels. Over the last few years, the tech giant started making similar moves to diversify its operations. Here's a closer look at how Samsung and Apple's manufacturing moves from China are reshaping their businesses, and what the strategies reveal about the rapidly shifting global supply chain. In 2008, Samsung set up a plant in the Bac Ninh region of Vietnam to reduce its dependence on China. Tech industry analysts say it was a forward-thinking move for the South Korean company.
They benefit in a lot of ways. They benefit from cheaper labor in some of these countries that they're moving to. They benefit from being insulated from some of the geopolitical tensions that come with operating in China and continuing to expand in China. They also benefit from being insulated from the kinds of supply chain shocks that we saw during the COVID lockdowns in China and the supply chain disruptions that resulted from that.
Over the next decade, rising labor and operating costs in China made it difficult for Samsung to produce its phones cheaply. That, coupled with intensifying competition from domestic smartphone rivals, led Samsung's market share in China to plummet. Meanwhile, the company was slowly moving its smartphone operations out of the country. Since 2013, the number of Samsung employees in China has fallen by 70%. Samsung still kept significant manufacturing centers in China, including for its expansive memory chip business.
Samsung Semiconductor.
But moving its smartphone operations meant the company was shielded from many of the Trump-era tariffs on Chinese-made goods.
Those tariffs, coupled with the geopolitical tensions developing between the Western world and China, led a lot of companies to, reconsider where they're manufacturing things.
By 2019, it had
shut its last phone factory in the world's biggest smartphone market.
1 year later, the pandemic hit, propelling tech companies like Apple to make similar moves away from China.
China had a very strict COVID policy that led to a lot of disruption for many of these companies and seriously pushed them to consider manufacturing elsewhere where that kind of disruption would be less of a thorn in their sides.
Apple's plans gained even more momentum in late 2022 after violent protests rocked the company's largest iPhone manufacturing plant in Zhengzhou, China. Demonstrations erupted when the workers, who had been under strict COVID lockdown for weeks, learned bonus payments would be delayed. At the time, Apple said it was working with the facility to ensure employee concerns were addressed. According to analysts and people in the company's supply chain, Apple no longer feels comfortable having so much of its business tied up in one place. While different events first propelled Samsung and Apple out of China, their new supply chain strategies focus on the same places: India and Vietnam.
These countries, some of them have offered tax breaks to companies to locate their manufacturing. There have been, in some cases, grants and other incentives that are hard for these companies to pass up.
Samsung pays about 10% corporate income tax in Vietnam versus China's standard 25% rate. It now produces half of its smartphones there. Apple also has operations in Vietnam. The company started producing its watches in the country and moved some iPad manufacturing there too. In Apple's most recent list of its top 200 suppliers, 25 were in Vietnam. That's 25% higher than 4 years ago. Then there's India. Around 20 to 30% of all of Samsung's smartphones are now manufactured there, according to Morgan Stanley, and it's still expanding. In 2022, it opened the world's largest mobile phone factory near New Delhi. These moves helped the company to become a dominant force in India's rapidly growing smartphone market, the second largest in the world behind China.
Awesome Galaxy A14 5G, now at just ₹44 per day.
In 2022, Samsung accounted for around 20% of the country's total market share, while Apple held less than 4%. Apple is working to change that. In a recent earnings call, CEO Tim Cook said,
India is an incredibly exciting market. It's a major focus for us.
So this year, Apple has said it plans to manufacture a portion of its iPhone 14 models in India for the first time, which is a significant move. The company is essentially saying that we want to diversify.
Tech analysts say manufacturing iPhones in India and then selling them to the surrounding Southeast Asian market ensures a smooth and more resilient supply chain. Apple's longer-term goal is to ship 40 to 45% of iPhones from India, according to supply chain analysts. In 2022, that number was in the single digits for the company. More recently, the company started moving manufacturing even closer to home. A multi-billion-dollar deal with U.S. chipmaker Broadcom will allow Apple to source critical chip components from manufacturing hubs around the U.S. But even as Apple and Samsung spend billions to move away from China, the manufacturers may still depend on suppliers there. During the height of the 2020 COVID-19 outbreak in China, Samsung found itself scrambling to secure suddenly scarce Chinese components.
There's also a political challenge because these companies, many of them still need to manufacture in China to some extent, and they need to be delicate about how they handle diversifying their supply chains.
Even though a supply chain shift won't happen overnight, Samsung and Apple's manufacturing strategies reveal a larger de-risking trend that's transforming global markets.
It's kind of like diversifying a portfolio, if you will. Increasingly, as the US and China, that relationship becomes more contentious, and a lot of Western companies see China as more risky. And so they're thinking about doing less in China. They're thinking about de-risking from the perspective of the politics of the situation.